thank you all so much for bringing the wind, the weather, the rain, all the nonsense that is Texas in October. It's 91 degrees a week ago, and now it's this. I'm so delighted to introduce long distance our speaker today. I had getting to know last semester in my graduate seminar in tech applications and language teaching. He's turned out to be not just a terrific graduate student, but an amazing colleague. Juan Pinto graduated this past May with his MA in History, Languages, and Cultures from the University of Texas at Austin, where he also served as instructor in our Hebrew classes. He's currently a Fulbright Fellow in Israel, which is why we speak long distance. That's why the presentation is being shown remotely, and it's my pleasure to welcome him back to Austin, Texas, at least virtually. Help me welcome Juan back.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garza. I am happy to be here. Like Dr. Garza mentioned, I'm here in Israel, and so this setting for this specific presentation, for this specific topic, I think is perfect. We're talking about digital communities today, using the internet for language learning. Just a little bit, just quick kind of background information for why I'm giving this presentation. This is based off of a project that I did for Dr. Garza last semester before I graduated. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on, but the idea is to kind of present some of what I've discovered about digital communities and what I think are some possible uses for it. So I'm hoping that it's worth your time, that you braved the rain and the cold to be here, so thank you so much for that. A quick overview of kind of what I'm going to be going over today. So first of all, I'm going to do a brief discussion of the theoretical underpinnings of kind of digital communities, what that means, why, and the language acquisition aspects, the theoretical aspects behind that. Then I'm going to move on to kind of the chunk, the meat of my presentation, which is a discussion of various digital communities that exist out there, their customs, their common practices, some of the tools that they use and emphasize, as well as some potential contributions that I feel can be made by these communities within our classrooms, and also some difficulties. I will emphasize, based, as you know, on the title of my presentation, the use of digital communities specifically for interpersonal communication. I'll talk about other ways that they can help, but it'll be mostly based on that. And then lastly, I'll also go over just kind of some suggestions of possible pedagogical approaches that we can take, that we can uses that we can make of the digital communities within our classrooms. I'll talk a little bit about how to use them in classrooms, what our students have to gain, as well as kind of how they can redefine the teacher's role, the instructor's role in the classroom. So that's just a brief overview of those three things. So let's just go ahead and get to it. So first off, the theoretical background. Computer-assisted language learning research, so research within that field, has often emphasized technology's benefit within an interactionist framework. So based largely on Long's interaction hypothesis, as well as Swain's output hypothesis, and how we can use technology for essentially interaction back and forth, face to face, receiving input, giving output. That's something that's been emphasized a lot in the literature, and it's also kind of the angle that I'm going to take when I talk about digital communities, how they can be used for interaction. But I don't want to ignore the contributions that have also been made by a sociocultural approach to language learning. These were made popular by Landolf, who applied Vygotskian theories of language learning Vygotskian theories to language learning. And the sociocultural approach can give it can be critical to understanding the role of community, which of course is what I'm talking about today, digital communities specifically. So just to reemphasize, it's the interaction approach and the sociocultural approach. These two together, I think, kind of form the theoretical basis for what I think of as encouraging the use of digital communities in the classroom. So to talk a little bit about the importance of community as a whole, not just digital communities. Communities can come in many different shapes and sizes. They can be simply a study abroad group. Let's say that students go and they create a sense of community with that group, also with the natives in that study abroad locale. A sense of community that allows the learners, the students, to feel connected to people, to language, to culture. This can serve as a strong basis for motivation, for continuing ongoing motivation. Another example is, for example, heritage learners who feel a connection to their heritage language, whether their family speaks it or whether they simply have ancestors who spoke it. Again, motivation is the key here. It serves for a purpose for why they are learning the language. And I think that digital communities can do something similar, especially in locations where maybe the target language isn't spoken very much. There aren't many opportunities for students to interact with using the target language with natives or with others around. That's especially where digital communities can be very helpful. Now, a question: how often do language students or language learners in general feel discouraged or alone in their struggles? How often do we hear students who think that maybe no one else has had their specific difficulties, or who just simply can't find anybody to relate with? The teacher is up here, the student is here. That's a big gap. How do we fill that gap? Another question is simply, how common is it for our students to wonder if they'll ever reach their goals? I think discouragement, anxiety, this is something that's been written about a lot in the literature, and it's something that, again, digital communities can help with. How often do our students actually set realistic goals, or any goals to begin with? These are topics for a different day, not for this specific presentation, but those are important to ask. So let's talk a little bit about digital communities. So my plan is basically just kind of to show you what's out there. There is a ton out there. I definitely don't have enough time to show everything, but I want to show a few tools, a few platforms that I feel are important. So there are many platforms out there. These are separate communities that kind of clump around different topics, but they're also interconnected. Many well-known platforms include social networks, some of the ones you see here. Let's see right here. Such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. These social networks, I'm not going to be focusing on them very much today because a lot has been written about them, and they're a little bit different from what I'm referring to as digital communities. These are platforms that are used by digital communities, but within these platforms there are different groups that form. And so what I want to do is emphasize some of the other themes around which communities often form. These can include specific languages, so a community focused around learning Spanish, let's say Latin American Spanish, a community focused around learning modern Hebrew. Other themes can include specific tools, so there are communities for specific tools such as Duolingo. You've all heard of Duolingo. Duolingo is not just a tool, it's not just software, but there is also a community that exists around Duolingo. There are forums, there are people who are very passionate about Duolingo and what it has done for them. There's always controversy with all of these tools. Some say that it helps, some say that it doesn't, and I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Babbel is another one that's very popular. It's kind of similar to Rosetta Stone a little bit. Has a big community around it. LingQ, let's see, my head is covering it, but LingQ is another popular community, also a tool. And lastly, Rosetta Stone, probably the most well-known by everybody is Rosetta Stone. I will say Rosetta Stone is highly controversial, both in the academy and also within these communities. So I won't go too much into that, but there are communities that are formed around each of these. Also, another theme is specific blogs or bloggers or even methodologies that bloggers take for language learning. So two of these are, for example, Fluent in 3 Months. That's a blog. Benny Lewis is the blogger. You might have heard the name, might have not. He's very popular in the community. Some people like him, some people can't stand him. Basically what you would expect, like a celebrity, essentially. And he just gives ideas for how to learn language, what he's done. He considers himself a polyglot. And there is a community that exists, again, a community around that. He has forums on his blog, opportunities for different activities, working together, language or learning languages together, challenges that people undertake that he suggests. Another one is Fluent Forever. This one is a little bit different. It's very much an approach. It's a very specific methodology. And by the way, both of these have a book attached to them. So the books go by the names Fluent in 3 Months and also Fluent Forever. Different authors. Gabriel Weiner is the author of Fluent Forever. This community is one that's undergoing a lot of transition right now as it shifts over from methodology / book over to a specific tool, a specific mobile application. And so it's kind of in flux right now. And just like I said with the other communities, these are tools that can also be controversial. Some people like them, some people don't, which is honestly, in my opinion, great to get both perspectives, and the community is very good about having both of those perspectives heard. Now, something else that I want to talk about is a very representative community of kind of what's out there, and this is on Reddit, specifically the language learning subreddit right here. For those of you who don't know what Reddit is, just a very basic introduction. It's essentially a forum, just like other forums you might have seen, or threads of discussions where people can post questions, links, videos, articles to talk about, just interesting insights, and people vote either up or down on what they like, and based on those upvotes and downvotes, Reddit has an algorithm that kind of shows you what's popular in the moment. What's great about Reddit is that it allows for lots and lots of different groups to form around specific interests. Language learning is one of those. There are many, actually, language learning Reddits. This is the biggest one, language learning subreddit right here. And this is just kind of how they write it, r/ and then the name of the subreddit. That's just kind of how it works. Now, the language learning subreddit, I want to maybe show you, I don't know how well this will work, but let's try it really quick just to kind of show you. Okay, show you really quickly. So this is the language learning subreddit. These are some of the posts, the latest and most popular posts, and you can see, as you can see, this week's language of the week is Kazakh. There's always a language of the week here. Some of the topics, let's see, teachers involving religion when teaching Arabic. Interesting. Do you think in different languages? That's a discussion. Here's a video. Here's an example of someone who is fluent but makes grammar mistakes and forgets words. So these are just an idea of some of the things you will find on this specific subreddit, the language learning subreddit. So people talk about all sorts of things. They share and they learn language together. But what's really great about these subreddits, and the reason that these communities are so huge, let's see, the language learning subreddit currently has 144,000 language learners, and this is just one of the many that are on Reddit. The reason for this is that they are very welcoming to new members, and they are very encouraging. They also provide all sorts of resources for learning languages, specifically for teaching yourself a language. Let's see, I don't know if you can see this very well, but here are some wiki resources. And so the wiki, let's see right here, the wiki on the language learning subreddit includes topics such as how to start learning a language, frequently asked questions, lists of resources, and I'll talk a little bit about some of those specific questions just to give you an idea. Also to show you, here are related subreddits. So all of these subreddits have something to do with learning languages. Let's see, language learning jerk, interesting. Judge my accent. You know, there's all sorts of stuff for learning languages. And then this is really great. Here there are subreddits for specific languages. So if Afroasiatic languages, all of these, and each of these is a specific community surrounding that language on Reddit. So as you can see, there are lots of communities out there, lots of small, big communities. They're all kind of interconnected. A lot of people are very active on many of these communities. But like I said, Reddit is kind of one of those home bases for a lot of people. So to go back to the wiki here, I just kind of want to show, let's see, maybe a couple of the questions, common subreddit questions that you will see on here. So for example, is Duolingo good? So there's plenty of questions like these. Is such and such program good? What do you think about it? And you get all sorts of responses. So it's great for reading reviews. Also, is it really possible to learn 15 languages? Can I really become fluent in a language in 3 months? These are questions that people ask often, and so they've been answered often, and there are really good responses. And what I want to emphasize here is that these communities have good responses. They're not falsely optimistic. They're surprisingly honest and accurate in their information about language learning, about fluency, what fluency means. These communities are informed by a lot of the latest in language acquisition research. And I mention that because I think that a lot of instructors could be a little bit hesitant to kind of let their students go wild, go out there and just kind of see what everybody's talking about and come back with bad ideas about language learning, incorrect, inaccurate, and unrealistic expectations. My experience has been that that's not the case, that these communities in general, broadly speaking, tend to have very good, solid information. Information that is also still very practical and easy to approach. They are, it's very conversational, very helpful information, but it's also very thorough. Long lists of tools with reviews with what has worked for certain people, what hasn't. So just to be aware of this resource that exists. Also, let's see, here's an example of a common problem that you'll see a lot. I feel stuck at my level. And here's an answer that I found on the wiki specifically. And it says, unfortunately, there is no magic formula for you to follow to go from the long intermediate plateau to an advanced speaker. Now to me, that is solid advice. There is no magic formula. It is hard. A lot of people feel this. And so within these digital communities, not only can you find answers, but you can also find people who have gone through the same experience. So back to those questions I asked earlier, that students may sometimes feel like they have nobody to relate to. This is a possible source of, a possible place for our students to find people who do have those common experiences so that they can relate to them and they can start forming those bonds and those communities ultimately. Now something else that these communities are very good at, and I mentioned this briefly, is at giving repositories as a repository of resources and as for sharing resources. That's anything from software to specific courses like online, let's say online college courses, or methodologies, books on specific methodology, language learning methodologies, specific grammar books, dictionaries. These resources are out there, and as teachers we sometimes feel like part of our responsibility is to provide those resources, and it is. But I think it's also helpful for our students to know that there are other resources out there and that different people have different experiences with different resources. What I like, something that I like, is that in these language communities that I found is that they're not very how to explain this. So they have kind of best practices. They have best tools in general, broadly speaking, but they don't stick to that super hard. Essentially, what they say is do what you like. If you don't like using Duolingo, then don't use it because you're going to stop using it. Do what you like. And I think that's solid advice for anybody. And so this allows, involving our students in these communities allows them to make more decisions and to take language learning ultimately into their own hands instead of having the professor simply say, this is the way it's going to be. Some other things that I have noticed, and I mentioned that they're very welcoming to new members. They share resources freely. They're also self-moderated, so they moderate themselves through upvotes and downvotes, kind of like I mentioned, and through other means. Some common themes that I found through across various digital communities. One of these is the differentiation between self-teaching or self-learning and classroom learning, and then sometimes also tutors, learning via tutors. This is a topic that is very big, I think, and I'm not here to kind of say that one is better than the other. Of course, I believe in all of them, but this is a common differentiation, and you may notice if you go into these digital communities that there tends to be a little bit of antagonism against classroom learning. In my opinion, that's understandable. A lot of these people took years of language classes in high school, maybe in college, and they left and felt like they were not proficient at all. And so it felt like a waste. And so there is a little bit of antagonism. They tend to bash on classroom methods of teaching and of learning. Some people more than others. Some people are much more reasonable. But again, this kind of struggle, this kind of back and forth, I think, doesn't have to exist. And I think we as instructors, as scholars, as teachers, we have a role to play as well in welcoming these communities and in being part of them, so that members of these communities don't feel isolated or like they're fighting against institutions of higher education or of education as a whole, but instead that we can work together and we have things to learn from each other, I believe. One other thing I'll mention about one other common theme that I want to mention, excuse me, is the use and the emphasis on space repetition systems, SRS. This refers essentially to tools that automatically space out learning for you. So for example, Duolingo uses space repetition for its vocabulary. If you use the practice mode, it keeps track of when you last practiced certain words and what you got right and what you got wrong to decide what it should show you next. There's lots of tools that use this, but one in particular that is common across pretty much every community that I've been a member of is a tool called Anki, A-N-K-I. And Anki is essentially flashcard software that is open source and that does the space repetition for you, takes care of that. And the reason it's so popular is one, it's open source, so it's free and highly customizable. And two, there already are so many resources that exist for this tool that it's easy for anybody to kind of pick it up and find lots of resources in their target language. So just something to be aware of. Now that has nothing to do with interpersonal communication, so I don't want to go into it too much, but it is something that is widely used. So let's talk a little bit more about interpersonal communication. Forums, or Reddit, as an example of a forum-like platform, let's say, these platforms are great for questions about language, for learning about language, how the language works, questions of grammar, cultural questions, cultural practices, also questions about slang. These are the types of questions you find a lot of on these language-specific communities. They're great for learning that. They're also really good for practicing asynchronous communication. And so just a little bit on asynchronous versus synchronous. Asynchronous communication refers to platforms where you post something and then you wait, and after a while you hear a response. It's not back and forth, kind of like talking me to you, but it's a little bit more like this, where I present something and then maybe later on I get questions and then I give feedback, but it's not immediate. That's asynchronous. And forums are a form of this. So some forums, specifically, especially the language specific forums or subreddits, for example, are really good for going and practicing your language in this manner. Also, there are WhatsApp groups, very common around the world. I'm here in Israel, and nobody texts. Everybody just uses WhatsApp. Literally everybody. And there are WhatsApp groups that exist for language learning, where you get to just practice your language, and people will comment on if you make mistakes, or they just kind of answer your questions. You get to know people. It's nice for that. Now, texting is a little bit kind of on the line between asynchronous and synchronous. Depends on your definition, and also, how fast you're getting responses. But forums are good for that. Now, synchronous interpersonal communication, just to highlight a few popular tools. Italki is very popular in these language learning communities. Italki is essentially just a platform for language exchanges. A language exchange is where you find a language partner with complementary language skills to yours. So for example, say you speak English and you're learning Spanish, you go on Italki and you look for people who speak Spanish and are learning English. You get in touch, you go on Skype or wherever you want, and you start practicing each other's languages. However you want, really. So it's very customizable, very much kind of you do your own thing, but it's for getting people together. Italki does also provide professional instructors for pay, relatively cheap in my opinion, honestly. Private tutors, also kind of community instructors, people who aren't professionals, but they are asking to be paid to teach you things instead of just simply chatting. So that's Italki. And HelloTalk. So HelloTalk is actually a mobile application for chatting with natives or with language learners, and also for finding language partners. Also popular, and there are many of these, but HelloTalk tends to be one of the more popular ones, mobile applications. Discord is a little bit different, and Discord is one that I want to go a little bit more in depth on, because I think it's not only is it very popular, but it's on the rise in popularity. Discord essentially is similar to Skype, so you can do face-to-face or conference calls, kind of like what we're doing here, but it also has a lot of elements of chatting, group chatting, like text chatting, file sharing. It's very easy to build groups or communities in Discord. If you've ever heard of Slack, for example, Slack is a tool that's used largely by in the enterprise world, in the corporate world, excuse me, by companies, usually startups or small companies that are very tech savvy. These companies use something called Slack, and essentially they use it to communicate with one another throughout the workday, to share files, to do all sorts of things. And Discord is similar to that as well. So it's kind of a combination between Skype and Slack. Discord was created by and is used primarily by video gamers. And so if you use it, right away you can tell this is very much a gaming platform. But language learners have taken to it in droves, and I think, okay, partly maybe it's because a lot of independent language learners are also gamers, but partly it's also because just what the tool provides is very useful, I think, especially for interpersonal synchronous communication. It's great. And just to kind of give you an idea, I want to show you a list of, so this is on the language learning subreddit again. This is a list of Discord servers that exist in different languages. So here are some that are for mass language servers. So for many different languages, and within that server there are groups for specific languages as well, and I'll show you in a minute. But as you can see, there's a lot. Some servers for Romance languages, for Germanic languages, East Asian. There's lots of different servers, and a server basically just refers to a group that you connect to on Discord to practice your language. So I want to show you a little bit. Let's see how well this works. But here is, let's see. So here's my Discord, and okay, let's see. Okay, I think you can kind of see. So there are different. These are the different servers here on the left. So I'm a member of. I'm not a gamer anymore, so you won't find any gaming servers on here. Once upon a time, not anymore. So language learning. Let's see, language learning server. So this is a very broad server. This is the one from the Reddit, the subreddit, and there's different groups within that server. Some of these groups are for chatting, for text chatting. These are all for text. Some of these are for audio. So for example, this is an audio group. This is an audio group for music, everything else. This is just for chatting. Here's a cultural exchange server, again with different groups. Let me show you maybe, well, let's see, here's a Hebrew server. It's taking a bit to load. Okay, so a Hebrew server with different channels or groups for learning at different levels, different activities that you can do in Hebrew, off-topic discussion, and voice channels. So plenty of opportunities to practice using spoken language as well. And there's some other ones, Franglish, Duolingo. Let's move this back. So Discord is, again, one of those tools that's very common, very popular. And I encourage you to just kind of play around a little bit and see what you find that's interesting. Now, a little bit on the downside of some of the downsides of digital communities, broadly speaking. These require a certain level of technological know-how. Now, for most of our students, I don't think that's a problem, but sometimes it is, and for the instructors also sometimes. It's also easy to find people, I have found, with whom to have simple introductory conversations, to practice greetings and just kind of get to know somebody at a kind of shallow level. But in order to advance and to go at a deeper level, friendships are required, or at least deeper conversations about politics or topics or what have you that require that higher language. And that's a little bit harder to find. Specifically, it's harder to find those relationships that you can make on digital communities. It just requires more effort. Partly that's due to the fact that many people on these communities tend to be transient. They get really excited about learning a language. They go all out to buy all the books, do everything, and then they burn out and they don't come back. It's very common, and so you kind of have to do a little bit of searching for the people who have been for a while, or just talk to a lot of people. Get the students to talk to a lot of people and to feel comfortable making new friends. Now, let's see, I don't have much time left, but I do want to talk a little bit about, here's an example of Discord being used for a conference call. So it can be used kind of as Skype. I want to talk a little bit about the classroom and just, again, some suggestions for how these things can maybe be used within a classroom setting. I kind of divide these uses into two approaches. One is using digital communities as supplements to a more traditional language class. So that would basically mean maybe as a homework assignment, getting students to go out and find a language exchange partner. Something that I think could be very, very helpful for a lot of people, just to kind of get their feet wet and get to know people and practice speaking outside of class. Or maybe, I know a lot of people use Twitter That could be a digital community. Get involved in the Twitter for your target language and just tweet in your target language and respond to people's tweets. Um, Now, the other approach that I see is using digital communities as the basis of a course. And that's the project that I did for Dr. Garza last semester. I designed a course that I called Hebrew for Interpersonal Communication. Now, this course has not been put into practice anywhere. I have not taught this course, or nobody else has, as far as I know. And it's just kind of a theoretical idea that I had for how we can potentially create a course revolving or surrounding digital communities. And so to talk a little bit about that, so the course that I designed, Hebrew for Interpersonal Communication, is based on conversation hours. So the biggest percentage of the grade by far, and most of the time, is going to be used simply having the students speak, have conversations. I got this idea from my second semester Arabic class during my undergrad, where the teacher had all the students do conversation hours. It was 20 to 30 minutes every day with a partner from the class. And me and my partner ended up using Skype most of the time because it was more convenient to just do it from home. And it was awesome. I felt like I got the chance not only to know him in our target language in Arabic, but also to just feel more comfortable using it for real communication. It wasn't just practice this grammar, it was just get to know each other and just speak. And that's kind of the vision I have for using digital communities within the classroom. And so for this specific course, the idea is that there are conversation hours that are with the partner, kind of like what I just described. Also with a group, an assigned group within the class that rotates so they can get the chance to know different people in the class. Conversation hours with the class itself. So this could be, for example, instead of having the class in a building, have it online. And also with other people. So that can be go find a language exchange partner. It can be go find a tutor if you want to pay. It can be go find just anybody that speaks the language and just practice. Again, practice, 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 speak. And this course uses Discord, the app that I just showed you, the application, as the central platform for all the class communications and for all the class activities. And so Discord becomes kind of the central hub. Instead of using Canvas, for example, Discord is how you send out announcements. Also how that way students can be constantly in communication. I know Canvas has a kind of conversation feature that in none of my classes was ever a success. And I know some teachers emphasize it, and it's great. But something a little bit more like Discord, more like chatting, like real chatting, in real time a little bit more, and where you can share things easily. Something like that I think would be a little bit easier for students to use, and they'd be more motivated to use them. Excuse me. And so that's kind of just an idea, again, just a suggestion for one way of incorporating digital communities within a classroom setting. Now, this brings up the question of the teacher's role in a class like this. What is the teacher's role in all of this? Not just in a class where digital communities are the center, the foundation, but also just as a whole. If this is the future, then what is going to happen to teachers? A lot has been written on this, and I'm not going to go into it too much, but I think this just is part of the discussion. We need to kind of start reevaluating often what our role is as a teacher, as a professor, instead of standing up and professing, as Dr. Garza likes to say, or lecturing in front of the class. As language educators, we're a little bit more used to the idea of getting the students to be the center of the class, to participate, to speak, to do most of the speaking, in fact, in our classes. So we're a little bit more used to the idea. But what about the idea of letting them control the material and choose what to do with their time? I think digital communities provide a way for our students to take learning and really do do whatever they want to learn what they want, what they care about. If they like chatting with people through Skype, then they get to do it a lot. If they prefer to uh, chat anonymously by writing, they get to do that a lot. But either way, they're doing the things that they enjoy, which means they're going to do them more often, which means they're going to get more practice. And so that's what we want ultimately. And so I guess just kind of in conclusion, I think digital communities can be very motivating for our students and also for us as instructors. They allow learners to increase the time that they use communicating, which is a big issue for us as language learners, language educators. We don't have enough class hours for them to get all the input and all the interaction that they need. Digital communities is one way of maybe doing that. And it's not just communication, but it's communication in real life scenarios. Some people might be opposed to the idea by saying that, conversations on Skype are not the same as going to a cafe and ordering food and sitting down and having a conversation face to face. And it's true, it is not the same. I'm not saying that it is. You learn different skills, it requires different abilities. But especially now, with the rising generation and generations to come, this type of communication is becoming more and more common, not just for language learning, but across the board, as we know. And so instead of fighting it, instead of sticking to traditional forms of communication, why don't we embrace them, embrace digital communities, embrace digital communication and online communication, and recognize that it is real communication and that it is what our students are doing anyway. And so I see this as an inevitable shift, really, that's happening towards using technology for education. And so I just encourage you to embrace the inevitable and to make the best of it. And that is pretty much it. So.
Actually, can we thank you first?
Thank you so much. That was a very wonderful presentation. A couple of questions. Yes, you're right. We have to embrace the digital. We all try to. You said you used quite a bit of digital last semester.
I'm sorry, it's a little bit, it's a little bit hard to hear.
Yeah, you said towards the laptop. No, thank you. It was a great presentation. Wonderful presentation. I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about your experience last semester when you used it, more so about the pitfalls, because I try to use digital communities a little bit, not as much as you do, but I always keep questioning about the quality that our students are getting exposed to, and how does one control for it, especially at the lower level language classes. At the higher level, once the students are on their own and know a little bit, have a grasp of the language, it's a little easier. But when they come back to class, having been exposed to patterns which are not necessarily accurate, how do you control using digital communities?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So just to clarify, I did not implement this in any classrooms last semester. I just kind of designed the course, but I have been very heavily involved within the communities themselves. I guess for my own language learning and for encouraging friends and other people around me to kind of get involved a little bit. But I think you bring up a good point, and it's something that'll vary, I think, widely from class to class, teacher to teacher. For example, in some locations where the target language it can be widely found, let's say Spanish in Texas, in Austin, digital communities might not be quite as useful, especially at the lower levels, like you said. where it becomes more difficult to reach out to people if you barely know how to greet them in the language. But if you are teaching, or let's say from the student's perspective, if you are learning, I don't know, Kazakh, I don't know if there's a Kazakh community in Austin, just as an idea, as an example, a language that you simply can't, you don't have people to communicate with outside of your classroom. Digital communities, I think, just provides one way of connecting with other people and just getting more practice. I think you're right about the lower levels. So the course that I designed was targeted specifically for intermediate, high, around there students to practice and kind of get over the intermediate hump and into advanced a little bit. Maybe for a beginner class, it might just be that's something that you can implement a little bit later on once the students have a little bit more background in the language, feel comfortable with the language, with you as an instructor, with what's going on with language learning as a whole, and then start to implement some of these tools that for some people can be intimidating. So I think that's a good, valid point that you bring up. Thank you.
Other comments, questions, objections, please go ahead.
As we're in a university setting and assessment is for better or worse, and part of that we have some and how this kind of digital communication in the classroom would feed into how we're assessing the students.
Yeah, wow. Assessment. That's a tough one. I have a lot of mixed feelings about different kinds of assessment, as I'm sure you do. So just as an example, I guess, for the course that I designed, I try to think, when I designed it, I tried to think about a lot of these issues and design it in a way to address them. And so what I did for the course is, as I mentioned, most of the grade was based on participation within those communication hours. Assessment was so because Discord allows people to communicate and for others to join these communications, kind of my vision was that the students during their conversation hours would be speaking within Discord, within the server for the class, and the instructor or a TA at any time could come into this conversation, join it, and either just kind of sit back and listen and get a feel for kind of what's going on. The assessment in this case wouldn't be so much accuracy as much as just simply participation. And then on top of that, I did think of including some conversation or oral exams where it's communication, it's conversation with the instructor or with the TA for this, where the students get the chance to get to know the instructor, the TA, get to show off their language, the grammar that they've been learning, things of that nature. And I mean, this is used already in traditional classrooms, oral exams, of course. And because this course was specifically interpersonal communication, I figured instead of taking a written test, this made more sense for a class like this. But your mileage may vary. It depends very much on the course. And I think it is something that needs to be addressed as a whole assessment.
One, if I could just chime in and kind of comment, it goes back to the first question and this question as well. And then in a sense, the question is, what is your take on what I want to say here? I do, even in my first year class, as students go onto these shared spaces, knowing that the input they're getting may not
An excellent question. I sometimes have a hard time making sense of crash and comprehensible input in itself. That idea. Uh, for something like this, where students get the chance to go and just kind of experiment, they will get tons of input, of course. But I agree with you that I think there is something natural that learners and students start to pick up on when they look for things that they understand. And what I like about digital communities and about these learning methods is that because it is real communication and there is so much that is incomprehensible, like you said, learners quickly learn to make sense of it, to sift through what doesn't make sense. But because it's real, it's not forced, it's not textbook kind of clean cut. They they learn the tools that they need for communication, right? And I think you're right. I think that's kind of maybe what Krashen had in mind. Instead of making everything fit into the comprehensible box, let the students or let the learners find the comprehensible bits within the incomprehensible soup of language. But it's more real. I mean, that's how language is in the real world, right? And this is the real world. Online, I think, is the real world very much. And our students get to develop those skills. It is more difficult. It might be more discouraging. But I like that you do it early on, like you said, because early on means that they get to develop those skills early on. And they're more comfortable with it when they're confronted with people who speak in a way that is fast, let's say, incomprehensible to them. They can start to sift through it. They feel more comfortable with it.
Interpreter understood his I+1 model was comprehensible input was I, and the +1 was the next step, which often involves that which our students don't understand. And you're right, I think teaching them, letting them learn how to sift through what is comprehensible, what's incomprehensible early on is one of the best things. It's kind of survival skill, really, if we make them ready to deal with a live broadcast, and deal with live internet, and certainly study abroad in mid-country. Any other comments, questions? Sorry.
No, that's so interesting. I just like to say something. One, thank you for everything. This is fascinating. I sit on the edge of these things, so I have the benefit of not having to deal with assessments in the language community that but I wanted to say I found it very helpful being able to allow our students speaking to this idea of letting them guide their own learning. The adults are really responding to the idea of self-assessments that I think could work well on these sorts of platforms, particularly the flashcards which you're using, and things like that. And while I wouldn't know how to put that into grading, they use that as both review and repetition and the idea of self. So you can still get a little bit of an academic edge there that some people really like, which speaks to, I love what you said about do what you like. Some students will like that and some don't. So we can offer a little bit of everything, which is really great. But and the last thing I want to say, really just a comment, and thank you so much, is that this idea, these digital communities, it is what I've worked with Texas Language Center so grateful for. It's just another authentic material. And learning, they're going to get this flood of it, but they have to read through it. And it's so real world. It's just so rich, endless for those who we've been inspired to get out there. And some don't want to, and they want the textbook. I'm so amazed by those who just rather sit with the textbook, which makes me so sad. Anyway, just saying.
Thank you. No, I just want to really quickly, I love that you brought up self-assessment because that is exactly what these learners do. They assess themselves. The flashcard software, like you said, that is constant assessment. Constant. Did you get this right or wrong? And also they go through, I mean, the ones that take it seriously, they go through the assessment process for themselves by going online and asking, I wrote this paragraph. Is it right? Is it wrong? Tell me what I did here. There's a lot of that going on, which we don't see that in the classroom as much because, I don't know, I guess our students are just used to the teacher assesses and we just kind of sit there and we absorb. But I love that the people who are self-motivated on these communities, that's what they do. And ultimately, I think that's what we want our students to do. So that's a good point.
Juan, I know we kept you up way past your bedtime. We should thank you one more time for this really.
Thank you very much.